Welcome back. It's time to now check your performance on the function tasks by going over the solution. Let's go to the Jupyter Notebook and see how you did. Alright, let's begin by taking a look at the first task. It was to create a function that takes in two integers and returns a boolean if their sum is 10, so true if their sum is 10 and false if their sum is something else. Now, as you're beginning to code, you may have thought to do this. You could have said if n1 plus n2 is equal to 10, return true, else return false. So that's a perfectly okay way to do this, and you'll notice you'll get the same results if you run the code. However, remember that if you're just checking an if-else statement and you're only going to return the same Boolean value, all you really need to do is just return this Boolean value itself. So you could just write return the result of this comparison operation, and that's the exact same thing. So you'll notice you get the same result there. So all we're doing here is checking if the sum is equal to 10. Task number 2 was to create a function that takes in two integers, returns true if the sum is 10, otherwise returns the actual sum value. Let's go ahead and see how we could do this now. In this case, we will need the if statement. We'll say if n1 plus n2 is equal to 10, return true. Else, we're going to return the actual sum, n1 plus n2. And then when we run this, we'll get back those same results. Task 3 was to create a function that takes in a string and returns back the first character of that string in uppercase. You could actually do this all with one line. What we're going to do is index the first character off that string with brackets and 0, and then we're just going to say upper to get it in uppercase, and then we will just return this result. And that's all you had to do. You could have done this in multiple lines as well, but it's actually quite simple with one line. Task 4 was to create a function that takes in a string, returns the last two characters. If there are less than two characters, return the string error. So let's see how we would do this. We'll use control flow to say if the length of my string is less than 2, then I will return the error code. Otherwise, I'm going to return my string, and there was a link here for hinting, but we're going to use negative indexing of our slice. So we will go back 2 spaces from the end, and then go all the way to the end. And if you want more explanation about this, you can click on this link for the hint. But essentially all we're doing here is we're going from the very end of the string back 2 spaces, and then going all the way back to the end again. So it's a little confusing at first on how to use slicing with negative indices as your starting point, but you can just think of it as -2 from the very end, then go all the way to the end. And we need to check to see if our length of my string is less than 2, otherwise you'll get some weird results trying to get this one to run first. Task 5 was given a list of integers, return true if the sequence 1, 2, 3 is somewhere in the list. So this one's a little trickier, so let's go ahead and check out how we can do this. We'll do the following. We'll say for I in range, and the range we're going to do is the length of the list of numbers minus 2. And the reason we're going to iterate with length minus 2 is so that we can use I plus 1 and I plus 2 later in the loop. So let's see what we mean by that. We're going to say if nums of I is equal to 1, and, so note we're using logical operators here, nums of I plus 1 is equal to 2, and nums of I plus 2 is equal to 3, then we're going to return true. Else, if we've gone through that entire for loop and we haven't returned anything, we'll just return false. So let's go over the logic here because it's a little bit tricky at first. So we will say for I in range length of nums minus 2. So this is a way to iterate through the length of the list. However, if we did just the length of the list without this minus 2, we would end up getting errors here in I plus 1 and I plus 2 because we would get to the end of the list and keep asking for more. I would eventually be the end of the list and you would say plus 1 or plus 2. To avoid any errors, we will say length of nums minus 2, so that way when we do the very last check, this I plus 2 and I plus 1 aren't outside of the list. And then notice here how I'm saying for this range, check if this sequence happens to be true somewhere. If it is, return true. If I've done this entire for loop and it hasn't returned true, then aligned with this for loop, I'll just return false. Really make sure you check your indentation here. All right, so we get true, true, and false there. So we got the right results. Task number 6 is given two strings, create a function that returns the difference in length between them. And hint was absolute value, which means hopefully you're able to Google how to get an absolute value of Python, and you were able to figure out that it was ABS for absolute value. So all we're doing is we're taking the length of string 1, whoops, let's make sure we spell that right, the length of string 1 minus the length of string 2, and we're returning this. But if we were only to do this, then we would get some wrong results, so we would get -1 here. In order to get just the absolute difference, we pass this result into ABS for absolute value. Run that, and then you'll end up getting the correct results. Now on to task 7. For this next task, we were given a list of integers, and if the length of the list is an even number, return the sum of the list. If the length of the list is odd, return the max value in that list. So first off, let's create a little quick variable here called length, and we'll just set that to the length of my list. And then we'll do the following. We'll say if the length mod 2 is equal to 0, then we have an even value, and we'll return the sum of my list. Else, we will go ahead and return the max value of my list. So we can run that, and then we'll see the results here, 3 and 6. Your final task was to perform this replace and switch function. Now there's lots of different ways you could have done this. Let's go over one example solution. To start off our example solution, we're going to do the same thing we did last time. We'll start off with output being some sort of a list here, and then at the very end, we were going to return that output. And likely, since it's going to be a list and we want to return a string, we're going to say join the output. So this follows along with the logic from some of the previous lessons where we did a very similar example. However, in this case, we don't know how long the name is going to be. So what we will do here is say list range length of name. So what does this actually do? Well, since we don't know how long the name may be as far as how many characters it has, if we say length of something like John, it'll return 3. If we say something of length Sandy, it'll return 5. If we pass this into range, then we get back a range operator which defaults to 0 and then goes up to the length. And if we pass that into list, now I have a list that has as many index positions as there are letters in this name. So that's why we're doing this list range length of the name, in order to get a list that has as many inputs as the actual name itself. The other way you could have done this is to just say list of Sandy, and then you would have had the same result. So either way is totally fine. If it makes more sense to you to have it numerical so you can kind of go along, that this way is the way to do it. If it makes more sense just to cast or transform this string into a list using just a simple list call, you could do it that way as well. As I mentioned, there's going to be multiple ways to do this problem. So let's go ahead and just say output is list name, and then we will say for I letter, a little bit of tuple unpacking here, in enumerate our name. We'll say if the lowercase version of the letter is in a list of the vowels we create, so we'll say A, E, I, O, U. And we'll go ahead and ignore, sometimes people consider Y a vowel in certain cases. We'll just stick with these 5. We'll say output of I, and we'll reassign it to be X. Else, output of I isn't going to change, so we'll just have it be the letter in the name. And now we need to switch the first and last letter, so we'll take a variable called last and set that to be the very last item in the output. We'll set another variable called first, and that will be the very first item in the output, and then finally we'll do the reassignment. We'll say output of 0 is equal to last, and output of -1 is equal to first. And then finally, we'll join together the output. So that's how you could solve this problem. You create a list, you iterate through the name, do your reassignments concerning the vowels. If not, it stays the same. And if you do it this way, you don't need to actually do this sort of reassignment. However, if you did it this way, you do need to do that reassignment if you only have numbers there. If you have the actual letters from the beginning, you don't technically need to do anything there. So let's run this cell and see our results. So we'll say replace and switch James, we get the same results. Cindy, same result. Alfred, same results. Okay, so hopefully now you've learned how you can combine functions with other topics such as for loops, while loops, and control flow in order to get functions that have the capability to solve what seem to be real generalized problems. Great work so far. Keep in mind, this is a big jump in difficulty, and it's just the nature of learning something as powerful as functions. So if you're still having trouble with this, you can check out some of the resources for extra help. We'll see you at the next lesson.